Good evening, everyone. My name's Dave Mobbs from X-Rite Photo Europe, and I'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar with Ollie Kenshington. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, but unfortunately, due to time, we won't be able to answer all of the questions. Please use the questions box provided, and we'll take a selection of questions for Ollie at the end. So before Ollie gets underway, let me give you a quick introduction. So Ollie Kenshington is the owner of Coro, a film production company based in southwest England, specialised in the creation of high-calibre corporate documentaries and commercial films. Drawing on years of industry experience, Coro also offers advanced training and consultancy in all aspects of film production and post-production. Coro has had the pleasure of working with companies such as Sky, BBC, ITV, Gorilla Group, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and many, many others. For more information about Ollie, please visit his website, which is coro.co.uk. So I'll just change presenter to Ollie. So Ollie, did you get the message? Yep.
Yep, I've got that.
Great.
There we go. Okay, we all set?
Yeah,
so,
all good.
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone. So Ollie speaking, and we're going to start off our presentation by talking about placement of our chart. These charts are fantastically useful. They can make a lot of things consistent and easy once you get back from a shoot, and they can also make on a setting exposure quick and accurate as well. But there are a few things you need to get right, and if you start off by placing your chart in the wrong place, then everything subsequently can be off, and that can mean that you're not getting the best out of your chart, and you might start to think, well, hang on, what's this chart doing for me? And the first one's possibly a little bit obvious, but I see it happening enough to make me want to lead with this. So placing the chart actually in your scene. This first slide, this is a shot, this is the little colour checker video passport which I have, and this is a frame grab from the rushes of a documentary that we recently made about Gary Barlow. What is most important when you're placing your chart, whether it's the passport one like this or the larger size chart, is when you're placing it in your scene, it should be where your subject is. So that might be a product, it might be a person, whatever it's going to be. If your chart isn't where it is, then what will possibly happen, and probably will be happening, is that the light that's hitting your chart is not the same light that's hitting your subject. And that's what this is all about. It's about the light that's hitting your subject and making sure that you account for that, you can balance for that, so you can white balance and you can expose for that light. So as you can see here, the chart is right next to Gary's face, right next to my subject, and the light that is hitting it is going to be exactly the same light that is hitting his face, which is the most important thing. So in any interview situation, you're going to, obviously your interviewee, their skin tones, the ratio of light from the key side to the fill side of their face, that's going to be absolutely critical. Now, it does mean that the chart is relatively small in the frame, and I think that what sometimes people think is, I need my frame to be full of the chart. So in a situation such as this, someone might think, oh, hang on, let's move this chart so it's right up near the camera, so that it's filling the whole frame. And this is where the mistake creeps in, because then it's, in this case, that would be about 5 meters. It's quite a long lens I've got on here. So I would have had to have moved the chart about 5 meters away from my subject towards my camera in order for it to have filled the frame. And that's, as I say, not what the idea is. So that's rule one. The other really important thing to do is to make sure that the bottom strip, so with the color checker video, the bottom strip in the exposure section is a glossy black. And actually what you can see here is that the light is just catching and reflecting off of this glossy surface, and as such it's brightening it quite a bit. It's brightening it to the point where actually the difference between this mid-grey here and the black is very little. They're almost the same grey. If I just move on one frame, you can see here where the chart is angled away from any light sources, the glossy black strip is now properly black, and you can see that there's a substantial difference now between the shades that we've got with these two strips. So this is another crucial point. Make sure that you're not getting any reflections off of this glossy black. It needs to be glossy because it needs to create a depth of shade that gets us as close to black as possible. So you can't really print a deep enough matte black for it to do the trick. So the glossy black is absolutely important, but then the danger is, as I say, that you might just be catching a reflection which will be artificially raising the level of that strip, and that's going to cause potential problems with you later on. Here's a couple of other examples then. So here's this is actually a series of interviews that I did for a little shoot. It's actually a part of a case study that I'm doing for Apple at the moment, where we're looking at various different schools across the UK where iPads have been given to all of the students and essentially replaced textbooks. So pretty standard kind of format, series of interviews, series of cutaways and B-roll of children using the iPads. Here we've got one of our interviewees. This is one of the technology leaders at the school. Chart, as I said, in the scene. Getting your subject to hold the chart's often a good idea. If you're holding the chart yourself, there's two problems with that. Unless you've got extra people with you on set, then if you have to grab it yourself, then you then can't see your monitor so clearly necessarily. So you might be missing some of the information that you want to be gleaning from it. And the other danger is that if you're holding it, you're an extra large object that's in the scene, and you may well be blocking light from part of the scene onto your chart. So if you're leaning across your subject holding a chart, you might be actually leaning across one of your lights, for example. So you're then blocking that light, so it's not hitting the chart, and it's then not giving you an accurate representation of the light that's hitting your subject. So I often will give the chart to my subject to hold, and get them to stick it, as close to what's important. So in this case, their face. So we can see the main components of the chart there. Here's another one. I'm pretty shameless with this. It's always nice to turn it into a bit of a joke. Just get them to completely obscure their face and say, right, we're going to run the interview like this. Puts them at ease. Here's some of the B-roll that we were shooting then. So this was a scene where the children walked in and were doing a certain exercise. Again, it was quite a nice little device to hand it to one of the children, get them to have an important job. They had to hold this thing in the scene. And another one here. You can see the glossy black at the bottom there is free of reflection, so we've got the deep black that we're looking for. Now I'm going to come back to some of these shots a bit later on, and I'll show you what, from the other side of things, what my camera was seeing and how I was using my monitor, my onboard monitor, to make sure the exposure was bang on. So we'll come back to some of these. But to summarize, placing the scene, get your subject to hold it if you can, or if you're having to hold it, make sure you're not blocking any light that's hitting your subject and therefore the chart. And also make sure that you're not getting any reflections in the black strip at the bottom. Here's another one. This is me. This is actually some tutorials that I'm just working on or just finished for X-Rite themselves. And this is different in as much as this is actually a different profile that I'm using here. So this is S-Log2 that this has been shot with. So you can see it looks quite different to these previous shots where we've got nice deep blacks. You can see the chart looks very grey. This is obviously just part and parcel of shooting with different gamma profiles, and what will form the bulk of our talk today, because when you use these different profiles, black, mid-grey, white, they go all over the place, they move, and life can get potentially very difficult when it comes to exposing your image. Here's an S-Log3 one. Again, this is one of the charts that was used. This is actually the non-video chart, but the chart that was used for one of the interviews in our Gary Barlow documentary. This is S-Log3, so we're getting a more aggressive gamma profile now, really heavily squeezing in the tonal range of our scene into our camera. So we're going to look at how we can deal with that next. So before I get to the nitty-gritty of actually exposing correctly for these different profiles, I think it's pertinent to start off by saying which profile should we be using, and why. Again, I see this an awful lot where people have maybe heard from someone or read on a blog somewhere or sort of picked up from somewhere along the line that they should be using some sort of profile, and they kind of incorrectly think that that's somehow going to magically make all their images look brilliant. I've heard things over the last couple of years. I've heard things like someone handing over rushes to me and saying, "Oh, it's all right. I've shot it all S-log, so you can grade it," as if by shooting it in that log profile, I can now grade it. Whereas by shooting it in that profile, I now have to grade it. It's not necessarily that that allows you to grade it. It actually makes life a lot more difficult. But of course, there are positives to using certain profiles. And this is what I want to really sort of break down. And as an example, I've got a shot here. This is, again, from our documentary that we've just finished a few months ago. But this was a really, really good example of where not only were profiles chosen for their specific control of light, but also for their noise levels, which is another big thing to concern yourself with when you're choosing a profile. Is what does it do to the noise floor of your image? So this is a scene in Gary's car where we were driving around. It's actually some of the first stuff we see in the first episode of our documentary. And this is the raw, ungraded shot here. You can see instantly one of the big issues that we've got here is we are in a car on a very sunny day. So the discrepancy between the level of illumination inside the car and the level of illumination outside the car is huge. And that is dynamic range. That's what we talk about when we talk about dynamic range, is what's the difference between the darkest parts and the brightest parts of our image. And it sounds very simple when you say it like that, but actually it's changing all the time. So, you know, here we're dealing with the sun. We've got a lot of things that are beyond our control to a certain extent. And it's amazing just how reflective skin, for example, can be. You can see just the top of Gary's arm here. The sun was reflecting off of that, and that has gone. That is way out. Even though we're using a profile that should be able to keep in that highlight detail, you can see there are areas where it's gone. Now this was S-Log 2. I was using a Sony A7R II for this particular shot, shooting at 4K, and just because of the nature of that camera, it doesn't have S-Log 3 available on it. S-Log 3 would have pulled down a little bit more detail in these highlights, but I suspect it still would have lost some of it because it was such a bright highlight. Now, another conversation for another day would be about HDR and how that will hopefully solve an awful lot of these issues that we're going to address today. But we're talking about luminance level in the region of sort of 2, 3, 4,000 nits. They're well above the upper highlight limit for the current specifications that we have to adhere to for digital video. So they're gone, but that's fine. That's a decision that I made because, and this is something again that is something I see all the time, is people they'll be a slave to this highlight detail. They won't necessarily use you know, a bit of experience, or they won't use some restraint with this. They'll just think, right, this is my brightest highlight. I must keep that in at the expense potentially of all this detail around here. And again, it comes down to subject. You know, Gary is my subject, not the pavement outside, and not even really his arm. You know, we are used to seeing highlight information clipped in digital video. It's only in relatively recent years that we are able to pull back some of this detail. But people aren't going to look at this and just be appalled, and it's not going to stand out like a sore thumb, because they're probably quite used to it. And it's a small price to pay to actually get all of the rest of this image detail in. You can see all of this detail in the streets and the trees and the houses, and in Gary's face. We've got detail in the black shirt he's wearing, in the dark grey leather chair interior. And this is the graded shot. So this is once we've actually graded it. You can see, you know, we have lost a little bit of detail on the top of this arm, but I'm really not concerned about that because I've got so much detail elsewhere. And if I had have exposed so that that detail was here in his arm, you wouldn't have seen anything. You know, all of this would have been lost. As I said, maybe if I was shooting S-Log 3, it would have been slightly better, but it's still, we're talking about a reflective object that and a level of illumination from the sun that would have made it really difficult. So the first step then is to think about what is the dynamic range in my image, and what can I reasonably expect to contain in my format, in my codec that I'm shooting into. If we look at this next scene, so this was a slight different angle. This is a cut-in where we had Gary indicating, and initially I forgot to take it out of S-Log2, and you can actually see here the amount of noise that we're picking up. So whereas this looks nice and clean, and I've graded down the steering wheel, the black shirt, I've graded that down, so we've got nice clean blacks once it's graded. You can actually see in this shot the noise. You can see it on the underside of the indicator stalk. You can see it down here where we've got little light. You can see it massively in this area. And so again, this is one of those times where let's think about the dynamic range that I'm actually trying to contain here. And although this is literally 10 seconds after I've just shot this, this has a huge dynamic range and this doesn't. So don't be afraid to switch profiles in the middle of shots, back and forth. It really shouldn't be the case that you just pick a profile at the beginning of a shoot, or sometimes people will decide on one in pre-production and they'll just stick with it rigidly and not think about what impact it's having on their scenes. If I had stuck with this doggedly without thinking about does it serve my shot, I would have had a lot of extra noise reduction work to do in post, and I would have ended up with an image that I'm not quite as pleased with. And in fact, this next shot there shows you what I did. So I flicked this now into one of the hyper gamma profiles on the camera, which is based on a standard Rec 709 gamma curve. So this is a much more standard linear gamma curve, which isn't going to protect highlight details. It's not going to pull up shadow details, but it doesn't have to, because there isn't that dynamic range in this shot. So you can see, tonally, this is quite a flat shot. The most reflective thing I had was Gary's hand. There's a little bit of a ping up here from the sun, but again, don't care about that. But look how much cleaner this is in these shadow areas. Much, much cleaner image. And it's just a quick change from one profile to the next. Perfect for S-Log2, not the done thing. This wasn't the profile to choose for this next shot. So quick flick, it's on a hot button on my camera, so I can quickly flick through, choose the appropriate gamma, get a nice clean image, and then pop back again for the rest of the shots or whatever I'm working on. So that's my real top tip when it comes to choosing an appropriate profile, is really understand what do the different profiles on my camera give me, what are they trying to do. And you can go to Canon, you can go to Sony, you can go to any camera manufacturer's website, and you can pull down white papers. They all have these white paper PDFs that really break down what these curves are doing, what they're trying to achieve, and you can see where does it put white, where's my mid-grey going to go, what effect is it going to have. They will almost always change the base rating as well of sensitivity, so that will normally result in a much higher base ISO, and that will potentially bring in noise as well. So if you fully understand and have researched and done camera tests in pre-production for what these profiles are going to give you, you can make the right choices once you're there on set. But if the last thing you should do is just not plan for it, stick it in S-Log or stick it in C-Log because you've heard, oh, that's the thing to do, and just leave it for your whole shoot, because you will find yourself with shots like this where the dynamic range just wasn't there, and you've actually used a profile that's then going to expose its weaknesses and give you none of its advantages. Okay, so another thing then, which then compounds this problem, is not only do you have the profile squeezing in extra information into into the same amount of space, you've then of course got potentially extra levels of compression happening afterwards. So let's be clear what's happening with these gamma profiles, particularly the more aggressive ones like your S-Log3s. What they are doing is they're taking a format, your video format, which is a fixed size. You can think of it like a bottle of water if you like. It's a fixed size bottle, and you are trying to squeeze more information into the same size. So it'd be like having a half-litre bottle of water and trying to squeeze a litre of water inside it. It does it by compression. And there are varying different types of compression that can take place. But in terms of gamma profiles, what it's doing is it's sloping off and compressing the highlight range to squeeze that highlight information into your container. And like any compression, that has a knock-on effect, and that potentially has a damaging effect on areas of your image. The key thing is making sure you understand where that compression starts, as we've just seen with the previous examples. On top of that, then there's the standard kind of compressions that will be taking place. There's the standard spatial compressions and temporal compressions that might be taking place by your camera in the format you're using. But one of the big ones, which I want to talk about here, is chroma subsampling, because this directly impacts on how much color information is left behind after it's done all of these other types of compression. So let's give a typical example. You might have an A7S or an A7R, or you might have a C100 or any of the XD cam cameras, any type of sort of middle of the road standard HD camera. There's tons of them that are in the hands of people today that are using these, that have the option to record log. So they're recording this compressed log image, but one of the big issues here is that they're recording it into a standard or sort of lower end codec. So the C100 is a really good example. Its codec is AVC HD, absolutely standard sort of consumer level and even sort of mid-level codec that's used. But the big thing about AVC HD is that it's 420. Now what that essentially means is that, let's take a standard full RGB signal. So in a full RGB signal, you've got color and luminance information at every single site. So essentially nothing is thrown away. 422, it chucks away every other bit of color information and then shares that from its neighbor. So this one's now gone, this one's now gone. You obviously can't have a color pixel next to a black and white pixel. So it takes the color information from here and it shares it with its neighbor. So you're literally halving the amount of color information that you started with. And with 420, remember this is what AVC HD uses, it throws away every other bit of color information and then throws away all the color information from the next line. So it's skipping and then removing entirely. So what it does is it takes that bit of information that's left and it shares it with its four neighbors like this. So you've now got 25% of the color information that you started with. Now that's a hugely useful way of squeezing a huge amount of HD data into a small space, which is what AVC HD is optimized for. But as you can imagine, that then makes color grading much more tricky. Now if you're shooting in a standard linear Rec. 709 gamma and you've exposed well, that's not too much of an issue, because actually you've spread your tonal range across your image as best you can into the codec, into the 8 bits of data that you've got there. And aside from a small amount of tweaking, you're probably not going to have to do very much to your image. It will be what it will be. So yes, you don't have that dynamic range control. Yes, you don't have the ability to push and pull around those highlight and shadow areas. But you are at least gaining probably the best amount of color detail and information spread across the range that you've got. It's just that there's not much there. So the real danger here, and where this really slaps you in the face potentially, is if you've got something like a C100, you stick it in C-Log, and then you record that stretched, compressed log image that will have to be color graded to make it look the way it should be, but you've put it into a container that's thrown away 75% of the color information. And you start to see now the danger here of actually log in the wrong container, in the wrong format, or if you don't understand what you're using it for, you start to see how actually you can really struggle, and you can start to end up with an image that just looks nasty, and when you try and correct it in post, it falls to pieces. Really, I would strongly recommend that if you can, if you're going to shoot log, ideally you would use at least a 10-bit codec 422. The higher the quality of that codec, the less information that's thrown away, the more room you've got for maneuver, and the better you're going to be able to put that log encoding to use. To give you an example, as we start to move into the future where we start to have HDR and be able to work there, 10-bit will be the minimum. You won't actually be able to record anything in 8-bit, and 12-bit will be the sort of become the new standard. And I think you'll start to see that. my prediction over the next kind of 12 to 24 months is you'll start to see more and more camera manufacturers creating cameras that have 10-bit and 12-bit flavor codecs at much lower ends of their range of cameras, because let's take Sony for example. They manufacture TVs, and a good way of selling a new TV to someone is to stick in something like HDR, but if they're also making cameras that can't actually record that extra information, then there's no point. So I think we'll start to see the TV industry actually driving higher bitrate codecs into the camera industry. So hopefully, 10-bit 42 might become, in a year or two's time, our new baseline. You can record HDR using log into 10-bit, and if you've got 12-bit, you can actually record linearly and still capture enough information for HDR. So I think that's the way that it's probably going to be going. But until that time, we need to be really careful about how we're packaging up these streams and putting them into these containers, and what we're doing with them. Let's look at exposing this, because whether you've got 8, 10 or 12-bit or whatever you want, whether it's shooting raw or not, exposure is still critical, and it's still a massive part of what these charts are meant to do for us. One of the big things with log profiles is that the highlight compression will start at a given point. So somewhere along the line of tonality, it will start to curve down and it'll start to compress your highlights. And the key thing here is that the point at where it starts to do that, you don't want critical things like skin tones to be in that compressed area. So knowing where and when to expose certain parts of your tonal range in your image is the key way of getting this right. Again, this information is available. I've pulled this chart off of Sony's website. So it shows you S-Log, Log2 and Log3, and where, for example, 90% reflectance should fall on a IRE waveform scale. So if you've got a waveform monitor on your camera that's hooked up, so in the C100 you've got one built in, but even if you don't, you might have something like a small HD monitor hooked up to your camera. If you've got waveforms, you can actually see this information. You can plot exactly where the 90% reflectant chip on your chart should fall, and this is the key part of exposing for the different profiles that you might be using. You've got to know what the profile's trying to do to squeeze your image in. So with S-Log3, you can see it's pulled the 90% reflectance. It's right down at 61. It's bringing that level down, and it's bringing it down so it's got more room above that point to compress the highlights. That's why we're managing to pull in that highlight detail that otherwise would be lost. So 18% grey here, you can see falling around 40% for S-Log3, 32%. This is dropping right down here. Typically this would be up near the sort of 45% kind of area. And you can also see how it's bringing up black as well, so we're getting a little bit more detail in the shadows than we would do otherwise. I think the key one here really is the 90% reflectance, because it's actually quite easy to get hold of objects and charts that include those 90% reflectant chips on them. So you can plot these, and really it doesn't take much to remember these, because it's 61% for S-Log3, it's 59 for S-Log2. If you just vaguely remember, right, 90% reflectant white should be at about 60% if I'm shooting S-Log, you're going to be in the right ballpark, and you're going to be actually getting the best exposed image for your camera. This is actually pulled from Canon's website, and this shows you the equivalent for C-Log. So with the older C-Log, you can see 90% reflectance here. That relates to a 62% IRE. So again, similar kind of area. And then if we look at this is again from Canon's website. This is a white paper for their newer C-Log2, which is used on things like the C300 Mark II. And if we just trace up, so reflectance here, 90%, that pulls up to 58% IRE. So we can plot again where that should be. But you'll notice that they're all kind of roughly 60%. So you're starting to see that if you're shooting log and you're using these 90% reflectance chips, but you're placing them where they would have been in the old linear or Rec 709 days, then you're actually going to be messing things up quite a bit. You're going to be overexposing massively. So knowing these numbers can be crucial. Now, once you know those numbers, the next thing is, well, how do you use that information? Probably the most basic way of using that information is using zebras in your camera. So pretty much all cameras have zebras in them, and remember, this top white chip on our chart is our 90% reflectance. So if that's 90%, I'm shooting with a standard, this particular scene that I photographed here, I was shooting with a standard Rec 709 gamma, because I'm pointing it at a chair inside, there's no direct light source, there's no great dynamic range, so no need to use a log curve there. So actually, in this case, it was really easy. I set my zebras to 90%, and just waited for them to appear and adjusted my exposure until they appeared on the 90% chip on the chart. You can see why it was so easy in the old days before we had to think about log in any way. So this is really straightforward. However, if I was shooting this with a log gamma profile, again, as long as I know those reflectance values you've just seen, it'd be a case of setting this to, say, 60% or 59 or 61 or 58, depending on the type of profile I'm using, to make sure that the same thing is being achieved. Let's have a look at how you can do that, though, with some extra devices. So this is one of the shots that I showed you earlier. Here's my chart. And of course, the color checker video, the big thing here is that it has these different exposure chips here. So we've got our glossy black at the bottom there. We've got our 90% reflectance white at the top there. And we've got this kind of light gray. This is somewhere around sort of 40% IRE. So we've got this information on screen. And let me just show you what my small HD monitor is showing me at the exact moment I was pointing my camera at this shot. So the camera's pointed at that. I record a few seconds of that chart. And you can see on my small HD monitor, which is hooked up via HDMI, I can actually see those chips. So right slap bang in the middle here, I can see there's my 90% reflectance, there's my my sort of light grey, my 40%, and there's my glossy black at the bottom there. It's pretty typical for the glossy black to have a slight sort of smooth and unsmooth nature to it. But these other chips, particularly the 90% one, should give you a really good idea of your exposure. Now, at this particular scene, we're inside. There's no bright direct light source. There's no huge dynamic range in this particular shot. So I was using one of the hypergamma profiles, which is based on 709, and as such, this 90% reflectance should be around about 90% on my waveform monitor, and you can see it's right up there. So I've adjusted the exposure in camera, live on set, with that chart there. So don't forget that these charts are a tool to be used at the point of recording, not just for post-production. You can get it exactly right here on set, because you've got, in this case, the small HD monitor, you've got the tools there to show you. Another thing that's very useful here is you can see this large sweep here is the TV that was in the background here, which was actually part of the thing that we were filming. And you can see it's right up, it's really in a dangerous area here, close to clipping. I've exposed my image, and reading this information and using the chart gave me everything I needed to actually set this exposure. And then first thing I did after I recorded this is I went over to the TV and I just dropped the brightness down, bringing this area in line with the 90% reflectance on my scopes. You know, the chart combined with the monitor gave me all the information I needed to actually adjust parts of my frame to make sure it was within tolerance and that it was going to be a pleasing image. In this case, it's a TV, but it could have been a key light or a fill. It could have been a light in the back of a set for a drama. You know, using this information at the time allows you to make tweaks and adjustments to sources of light that means you can record the best level of information that you can. Here's another one. So we've got the bigger chart this time with my slightly bigger section here. And we've got the addition of a dark grey. This should fall around about 20% IRE if you're using a 709 standard linear gamma. And again, here's what my waveform monitor is showing me. You can see the white chip up at 90. You can see the light grey falling around 40%. You can see the dark grey falling around 20%. And you can see the black not quite touching the bottom. Actually, that's because the hypergamma that I use does just slightly raise up the floor for the black level. It kind of brings it up to about 2%. So the exposure here is absolutely spot on. So the chart in conjunction with the waveform monitor on set has given me perfect exposure. So I can move from there in camera, in post-production. I know I can get the best out of my image. Even once I start pulling and pushing it around, I know I'm going to get everything that I need. Now, in terms of balancing your image, I'm going to give you a quick little demo inside Resolve. Here's a quick little example here of going from an S-Log3 to a color-graded image, but I'm actually going to do a live example of this inside Resolve. So I'm not sure if you use Resolve or not. It is free. There's a free version of it, so there's no reason not to download it and have a little play around with it. But I've actually got a shot here. This is the S-Log2 shot, and this is shot in 709. Let me just show you some of the differences in pushing and pulling this around. Remember, I'm using an A7R2 for this, so this is an 8-bit codec. It's 420 XAVCS, so I've got to really make sure that I can get the most out of that small container that I've got to fit my color information in. So, for example, with this shot, here's my waveform monitor down the bottom here. And I can see that it's exposed roughly where it should be because I did that in camera. But I can also see things like the blue channel is too high here. If I come into my controls, I can start to get this where it should be. So 90% is a little bit too. Let's just bring that blue down first of all, and let's just brighten that up so that we get that falling more around the sort of 90% mark. You can see my glossy black is quite high here. Let's bring this down so it's just touching 0, so black would be at the bottom of the scopes here, and then we can see that my 40% is falling pretty much at the right area. Let's just slightly stretch that up in the middle. Let's see if we can get a little bit more detail there. Bring this back down. Let's just drop that red out at the bottom, and more or less, just with a few little tweaks there, we've actually got an image now that's not only exposed absolutely bang on. The exposure now is absolutely precise. It was pretty close in camera. It's actually now spot on. But at the same time, I'm able to isolate and pull out the colors that I need to as well. Now, that's not going to be quite as accurate as using the reverse side. These are spectrally flat squares, these, so this should be a much more easy target to balance from. But I can get that very quickly to where it needs to be. That's color balanced, exposure's right, contrast is right, and really that's step one whenever you're color grading. Let's look at a slightly more tricky version of this then. So I'm just going to zoom in on this image, and I'm just going to mask it quickly. So if I get my mask over the exposure controls here, and I'll just hide everything else so I can see that. It then makes it really easy to spot those items in the waveform monitor there. I'll just bring down my black to where black should be, and I'm just going to bring my midtones up so that I get my 40% in the right area. Now this is an interesting shot because you can see that the 90% reflectance is really far down. That's because it was S-Log. So under normal circumstances, I would then bring that back up to a level where it should fit. But don't forget that Rec 709 actually is only designed to contain around about 6 stops of latitude, whereas my camera is actually designed with S-Log2 to squeeze in a lot more. So if I were to push that just arbitrarily up to 90, this is one of those times where actually it's not going to take into account the level of control I've got. So these highlights outside the windows, if I did that, would just disappear. They would all clip out, and I would end up ruining the shot. So this is where you then have to use a little bit of experience. You have to slightly look at what you're getting and try and keep it in. So if I were to bring this up too much, I would then lose all of that detail at the top here. But I can bring down my image in the shadow areas to get that in the right place. If I turn off the mask, you can see that contrast being applied to the overall image. If I just zoom back in again, the next thing to do then is to make sure that the colors are accurate. So I'm just going to quickly drop over here, and I'm going to isolate my saturated color chips, which are on the chart. And this time, I can use the vector scope to make sure that my colors are all falling in the correct area. So you can see these saturated chips, they all point off towards various different primary and secondary boxes on the vector scope, and they should be falling in or near those boxes to be accurate. But look how far away they are from where they're meant to be going. That really shows you how when you're shooting in log, you are stretching the color information to possibly breaking point if you're putting it into a small container. If I go back to this shot, which was shot 709, zoom out, I'm going to do the same here. Let's just isolate these saturated chips. Same chart, same day, same everything, just a different profile. And you can see, look, they're actually there. They're actually pretty much in the right place. There's very little tweaking I have to do here. So to tweak it, I go to my curves, I go to my hue versus hue, just add some control points here, and all I've got to do is just going to move these around so that they're falling in the middle of these boxes. You see green, you'll always find green and magenta are the ones that are most out, just due to the nature of deburying the image. Blue and magenta, let's just pull that around. It's far more important that they are pointing towards the correct hue, so that the colours are accurate, than that the saturation is right. So how far out they are from the middle is how saturated they are. You can use the hue versus sat to achieve that. So red's basically there, actually needs to come back a little bit, just to put it more into the centre. Cyan just needs a little bit more saturation. Magenta just a tiny bit more. So that's basically accurate. That's now done. If I remove my mask, that image is now fully balanced. You can see how much easier it was there compared to then if I had to do it with this one, where I'm going to have to actually push things quite a lot further. So I'm going to have to whack in loads of saturation, and then I'm going to have to go across and do more work with this. And if this was 10-bit or 12-bit or RAW, then I wouldn't be too concerned. But the fact this is 8-bit, actually there's very little color information here. And what will happen, and I'll see if I can get it to happen now, is as I start to move this around, let's get that magenta out there. As I start to move this around, particularly as I am in saturation, I'm trying to force color information into areas where there isn't color information. So the red's not too bad, but if I take something like green here, to add enough saturation into this to actually get it in the right place, what you'll notice, it might be hard to see on this webinar, but the actual traces are starting to fall apart. They're actually starting to separate and appear thin on the screen. And that's a dead giveaway that the color information just isn't there. It's actually starting to color sort of dead pixels almost. There's nothing really there left to give. And so I've actually pushed the image too far for what I've managed to record. So the top tips really are then, just to summarize, is to make sure that you've got enough information in your container. So try and shoot 10-bit or 12-bit if you can, or if you are shooting 8-bit, be extra mindful of, do I need to shoot log? What's the dynamic range actually like in my image? Do I need to squeeze this and compress this in, or can I get away actually with using a standard linear gamma? And be prepared to switch gamma profiles mid-shoot, even mid-shot as you're moving around. Don't think that because you decided on S-log3 in the morning, it's still going to be S-log3 come the afternoon. Move around, think about what you're trying to achieve. And then finally, go to the manufacturer of your camera and find out what are the values, where should 90% reflectance be for the profiles that you have your camera by the manufacturer you've got. Once you know that information, you can then set your exposure precisely, and by setting your exposure precisely, you're ensuring that key things like skin tones are in the non-compressed part of the image, or the part of the image with the least amount of compression, and that you can get the best out of your image when you come to color grade it at the end. So there's a huge amount of information there. A lot of this might be new to you, but do bear with it and try and stick to it. And to help out, we will be having some tutorials based around this stuff I'm using now, which will be going up onto X-Rite's help pages. So in the coming weeks and months, you'll be able to revisit those, and hopefully that'll give you some more information about some of the things that you've just seen inside Resolve. We also show you how to achieve similar things with Premiere and Final Cut 10 as well. But let's take some questions. Dave, what have you got for me?
Thanks for that, Ollie. That was a great presentation. Some very good comments, especially the tips. People seem to have found this really useful. So yeah, we have a few questions here.
Okay.
The first one's from Jing, and he says, in post, he's not using glossy black strips to match colour. Why does the strip matter?
Okay, so yeah, it's only really for exposure, that glossy black strip, and as long as you're using, as I said, as long as you're remembering the tips about not getting any kind of reflection off of it, because that will raise it and essentially neutralize its usefulness. As long as you're doing that, then that glossy black is perfect for then lining up with your waveform monitor. So you can see here in this image, we can put that exactly where it needs to be. In fact, it needs to come down a bit more. Exactly where it needs to be on your scope. So in terms of matching cameras, you can end up putting that where black should be across all your cameras. Really, matching cameras is more about color, I think, for me. Contrast is actually quite simple compared to trying to match the colors. Particularly if we look at what we're looking at in the vector scope, you will see this kind of pattern. I said magenta and green, they're always the ones that suffer. That's just because of the nature of debarring a color filter array that's placed in every single camera that we use. That's just the way that digital cameras work. And Canon and Sony have different techniques for tweaking that. So if I'm trying to match Sony and Canon cameras, you'll see the green bias in the Canons, you'll see the magenta bias in the Sonys, and you'll see it reflected here. But then you can use these tools to put them exactly where they should be and therefore make them match. So for me, matching cameras is more about the color chips. In terms of matching them with the blacks, the glossy black particularly is just a reference point for the bottom end of your waveform monitor.
Great. We have a question from Ashley. What camera or cameras did you use to shoot the Gary Barlow documentary?
Okay, yeah, good question. We used, our main camera was a Sony FS7, and in fact, let me just bring up the reference for that. So the main camera we used was the Sony FS7, which we used for all of the main interviews. So let's go to this one. So this main interview here is FS7. That's shot S-Log3, and we also had an A7R2 just for B cam. So stuff like these shots that we got inside the car. That was A7R2. And those were the two main cameras we used for the whole shoot.
Great, thanks for that. Another question, is AVC HD a wrapper of H.264?
Good question. No is the technical answer. The wrapper is actually MP4. So wrappers are formats that contain codecs. So one of the most well-known wrappers is .mov, and MP4s are also very well known. So these are wrappers. Within them are varying different codecs. So H.264 is, if you like, the kind of brand name almost of AVC of MPEG 4 layer 10, which is AVC, which is what AVC HD is based on. So it's kind of there's a real quagmire there of different terms, but AVC HD and XAVC and all these other ones, they're all based on MPEG 4 layer 10, which has a working title of H.264, and they're all wrapped in an MP4 wrapper. I don't know if that helps you or not, but yeah.
Great. So would you say the log for the GH4 is not a good idea? This is a question from Suresh.
I'll be perfectly honest, I have barely used the GH4 for whatever reason, not through any negative association with it, but just through sheer circumstance. I've not used the GH4 very much. As far as I'm aware, it's going to be a similar kind of response to any of these other DSLRs, which is that if it's recording into an 8-bit codec, you need to be wary. You need to be very wary about shooting log, which is by its very nature compressing your dynamic range and compressing it into an already highly compressed container that's quite small. So 8-bit is like a small bottle of water, and you're trying to squeeze and compress a lot of water into a small bottle. If you can get it, I think there's a 10-bit internal codec with the GH4, I think I'm right in saying. So in that case, yeah, I think you're certainly much better off. I wouldn't ever say don't shoot log into 8-bit, because it has to be done, and in fact I've done it in some of the stuff that I think it's just about being wary, particularly of the more aggressive ones. So for example, on the A7S II, which is a camera I do use a lot, you can record S-Log3, and that's a far more compressed and aggressive gamma curve, but still squeezing it into that 8-bit container. So you just need to be very wary of exposure and color balance. It's far less forgiving than it would otherwise be. So I wouldn't rule it out entirely. It comes down to how good that codec is, and as far as I'm aware, I know that GH4 is actually meant to be very good, and I think I'm right in saying it has a 10-bit codec, or maybe it spits out 10-bit over HDMI, which is quite a good point. If you do have a DSLR that's 8-bit internal but will do 10-bit over the HDMI, then get a recorder, get an Atomos recorder, and then you're going to be able to record, 422 or 444 10-bit out the HDMI, or with bigger cameras out the SDI, and that will give you, the color information that you need to really push it around and make the most of those compressed log images.
Okay, great, thanks for that. So I have a question from Dane. He says, which gives the better color profile, the color checker video or the color checker passport video?
Oh, well, they should be identical. They're no different. It's just the physical size. So the saturated color chips that you see on the passport version of the color checker, and the saturated color chips you see on the full-size one are designed to be identical. That's what makes it such a fantastic device for consistency, because it doesn't matter what camera's pointing at it or who bought it and when they bought it, it will be the same as any other color checker, including the non-video one. The saturated chips are the same. That most of we can see here on this shot here. This is the non-video one, but it's got the RGB and then cyan, magenta, and yellow saturated chips on that as well. It shouldn't be any different. So it doesn't actually make any difference as long as you're using it.
Okay, great. So final question from Richard. Should the RGB of your white, grey and black chips overlap? In other words, can I use a waveform monitor to white balance the camera?
Yeah, you absolutely can. This is I must admit, I'm not 100%. I don't know for certain, and I'm leaning towards the answer being no, that these are spectrally flat. The reverse side is definitely spectrally flat. So this side, this is definitely spectrally flat, and absolutely use your RGB overlay waveform monitor to balance that out. That's what I do every single time I'm white balancing. I'll have the grey side, the spectrally flat grey side up on my subject, and then I'll use my small HD monitor to bring up the RGB overlay. And then I will drill into first of all, my color temperature, so I'll set the Kelvin. I won't look at my camera, I'll actually just look at the monitor, and I'll move it up and down, setting the Kelvin until I see those red, green, and blue traces overlapping and going white. If they don't perfectly overlap, then it probably means that there's a bit of a color bias in your lighting. So it shouldn't happen if it's daylight, but if you're inside and there's fluorescence or some kind of other light source nearby, then it may well be they don't perfectly line up. And now what I do on my Sonys is I then can drill down further, and I actually get up a grid where I can add in or take away green and magenta, blue, yellow, and I can just again tweak that until I see them perfectly line up. I reckon it probably takes 15 seconds. So in conjunction with the spectrally flat grey side and my small HD monitor, I can have a white balanced image where they are perfectly overlapping and balanced with, yeah, as I say, about 15 seconds. So it's a really good one, and if he's doing that, then carry on doing it. But as for whether or not these ones are spectrally flat, I don't think they are. I mean, they're going to be pretty damn close, but I know this side is definitely spectrally flat, so use this side.
Great, thanks, Starley. So I'm just going to change presenters to myself. I'd just like to point everybody to the offers that we have. which are purely for this webinar only. So on xritephoto.eu, we are offering the webinar group 25% off all X-Rite products. That includes photo and video products. Just use the discount code OLLIE25 at the checkout and you will automatically receive that 25% discount. So just so you're aware, this is only available for 1 week, so the discount actually expires on the 27th of June. So if you were thinking about getting any charts or monitor calibrators, then now's probably a good time to do it. So I'd just like to thank Ollie and thank everybody for watching. We really hope you enjoy the webinar. If there are any more questions, we'll try and collate these and answer them when we can. We will also be uploading and recording this webinar tomorrow, so anybody that's registered will be able to receive a link to that recording tomorrow. So don't forget you can learn more about Ollie and his work at coro.co.uk. And once again, thanks, Ollie.
You're welcome. Very nice to speak to you all today.
Great. Hope we see you all for the next one. Thank you.